To some, he's a crusader for truth, a whistleblower who shone a spotlight on the murkier aspects of the US wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. To others, he's little more than a hacker and a criminal, and one who needlessly put lives at risk by disseminating confidential information. To all, however, he is Julian Assange, the founder of the website Wikileaks, who is now making his way home to Australia after 12 years spent under house arrest, then a room in the Ecuadorian embassy in London, and finally, a cell in Belmarsh high security prison. Back in 2010, his site released a trove of classified US military reports, eventually leading the United States to seek his extradition. Here's Assange speaking from the balcony of the embassy 7 years ago, 7 years into his fight.
7 years of detention without charge in prison, under house arrest, and almost 5 years here in this embassy without sunlight. 7 years without charge. Why my children grew up without me. That is not something that I can forgive. It is not something that I can forget.
Now the US government will accept a single guilty plea from Assange at a court on the US territory, the Northern Mariana Islands, and he will be released on time already served. But exactly who is Julian Assange and what was WikiLeaks? I'm Niall Paterson. Welcome to the Sky News Daily. Now, I'm going to be talking to our international correspondent Alex Rossi about Julian Assange's imminent release and exactly how we got here, a day many of his supporters never thought would come. But first, let's chat to Vaughan Smith, founder of the Frontline Club, an organisation for independent journalists and a friend of Julian Assange. Vaughan, how are you feeling?
Oh, I'm extremely pleased. It's a very good day. And it's been a day that we've been waiting for over a decade. So yes, and I'm very pleased. Particularly for Julian's wife, Stella, who has led, with Julian's father, the most extraordinary campaign on his behalf, and also for his children. I think it needed drawing an end to, and I'm very pleased that an end has come.
How did you two first cross paths?
I knew of Julian because he had done this extraordinary release. It was of this American helicopter. You can hear the pilots talking to themselves, and they're shooting up some people on the ground, which turned out to be two Reuters journalists who they killed, thinking they were carrying weapons when they weren't. And Julian released that in America. And then a few days later, he knocked on my door at the Frontline Club in Paddington in London, saying he wanted another press release. So, he wanted to meet more journalists and talk to them about a new release. I was very pleased to accommodate him.
And I suppose, given your background, given your time working in exactly the circumstances as displayed on that video, you were perhaps minded to give this man as much help as you possibly could.
I started a news agency called Frontline News Television. We had 18 members, 18 freelancers. Half of them were killed. And we were very much bottom of the food chain in the news industry. So, yes, somebody who came sideways into the industry, into journalism, would likely get a sort of friendly reception by me, yes.
And what was he like at that point?
He was this tall, slightly lanky, blonde Australian with a massive brain. I mean, he was somebody who you always surprise you by the amount of time and attention he gave you or gives you. I'm sure that hasn't changed. I found him very likable, extraordinarily good on computers. He was somebody who the Americans said was aspergic, which meant that he, was mathematically extraordinary. And an incredible problem solver. I think where I felt others misunderstood him, because for a period of time it seemed like the whole world and the whole of journalism turned on him, was that I was absolutely convinced, knowing him as well as I did, and seeing him, the way he responded to my children and to my family and to other people, I was absolutely convinced that Julian got out of bed every morning firmly in the belief that what he was doing was promoting freedoms for all the rest of us, every day.
Well, let's focus now on what's happening, literally, as we speak. Our international correspondent Alex Rossi has been following Assange's flight to freedom. Alex, look, how on earth did we get here with Julian Assange ultimately accepting his guilt on one of the charges against him.
Ultimately, they've done a deal. This is one of those stories where alleged criminality intersects with political expedience. He, of course, has always said, I'm innocent. I'm a journalist. I'm carrying out my duty. It's all in the public interest. But at the same time, he's been in jail for 5 years. His health mentally and physically has deteriorated. 7 years in the Ecuadorian embassy. And clearly, he and his team have decided, just, put your hands up to this and get out of jail. But what will be interesting is what they say after the I's are dotted and the T's are crossed, and he walks and he's safely on that flight heading, I think, back towards Australia. But you think about this, Neil. This is a man who's Julian Assange, who said that this is a fundamental issue of press freedom. This information that I've managed to get into the public domain, biggest scoop of the 21st century.
Arguably, yeah.
I am an innocent man. But now he's actually saying I'm guilty to one of these espionage charges. That will stick in his craw. And I think he will probably spend a long time in the days, weeks, months, perhaps even years going forwards, trying to clear his name and rehabilitate his reputation.
Let's hit the rewind button here, Alex, and take us all the way back to 2006 when WikiLeaks was set up. Because, to be honest, you and I suspect you felt like me a little bit today. I didn't realise, the best part of 20 years on from the founding of this organisation, it's been something that you and I will have had in our brain for many a year, but many people listening to this might not have even heard of it.
So Julian Assange starts up with, as a collective of people. I mean, there were other people behind it as well. Servers in Iceland and Sweden and other places, and you could upload information, documents, and he would appeal to whistleblowers to come forwards with these very sensitive documents, and then they would publish them.
Just on that point, so what was the service afforded to these whistleblowers in giving the information to WikiLeaks?
Well, they could give it like any whistleblower. It could be done confidentially.
And WikiLeaks, presumably, with their servers in Iceland, not necessarily as in the firing line as if their servers were in the UK.
Exactly, and it was a way of getting information out into the public domain.
Let's talk about the Chelsea Manning series of leaks. Started coming out in 2010. And to be fair, until that point, WikiLeaks had kind of flown under the radar, I think, for many, many people. But Chelsea Manning downloaded US military reports from Iraq and Afghanistan because of concerns that they had about a disinterest amongst the American population, her friends, family, when she went home, but also about the manner in which it was being prosecuted.
Yeah, she was serving in the US military as an analyst and accessed classified computer networks and downloaded huge numbers of documents. I mean, we're talking about the biggest security leak of classified information in American history. I mean, that's how big it was. And they were... What she then uploaded to WikiLeaks and then they went on to publish was, I mean, it was revelatory. I mean, it was huge, some of this stuff that came out.
Give us just a flavour of some of the things that we learned.
Well, the kind of headline stuff is you're talking about significant human rights abuses to do with Iraq and Afghanistan. A lot of those abuses were carried out by allies of the Americans. Another thing that I think was hugely significant is that the number of people that were killed, civilians in Iraq, the figures that were put out publicly by official channels, they weren't the figures at all. I mean, the number of people who were killed during let's call them the 9/11 wars far exceeded those figures. So and this is where his team and he would argue and supporters would say this is big stuff. It's in the public interest. It should get out there.
And of course, along with that, there was the diplomatic cables that came out, which caused huge ructions between the United States
and I mean, this is the other thing: embarrassment. His supporters would say that this is the prosecution against him was of a political nature. He was being persecuted because he put it to the United States and he ultimately embarrassed the state of America.
So this all came out in 2010. The Americans, you could argue, rightly annoyed, at least initially. But, as you say, there were an awful lot of revelations in there that, that frankly we needed to know about. But it wasn't the data leak that they first... That criminally he was first pursued for. In fact, wasn't it? It was Swedish authorities.
Accusations of rape and molestation going to a WikiLeaks conference that happened in Stockholm. They ultimately went after him, and then he felt the law here, and then went into the Ecuadorian embassy in London. So, yeah, that's what did. And critics of Julian Assange will say, hold on, if you are. And those charges, we should say, have been dropped. But if you were innocent of those charges, why did you run into the Ecuadorian embassy? I mean, we talked about how embarrassing it was to the United States that these revelations were made public, but we should also put perhaps the other side of it. And their side is that actually Julian Assange is not a journalist, he's a hacker, and he's an activist with his own agenda, and that the documents that he put into the public domain put at risk Americans working in dangerous environments. They put at risk people working with the Americans, particularly translators working in Iraq and Afghanistan, and therefore, that's a criminal offence and should feel the weight of the law.
It is the manner that the information was released that I think, well, let's be honest, a few journalistic noses were put out of joint that someone like him had got this scoop and that we hadn't. But also there were concerns about the probity of the way in which this organisation was working.
Yeah, I mean, many of the documents were stolen. The other thing to remember is that we are talking about something that happened, and this is looking at it in a bigger historical perspective. We're talking about technological infancy. We're talking about disruptive technology and what it means, which is, I think, one of the reasons I think that the Americans have kind of grappled with this in such a ungainly way. And what does the internet mean? What do servers mean in places that you can't get at them and you can disseminate this information? I mean, how do you deal with that? Well, we've seen how they deal with it. They 18 indictments against Julian Assange.
And, 2,487 days in the Ecuadorian embassy, because he then went on to Belmarsh. What happened there? I mean, was it just that the Ecuadorians' patience for Julian Assange ran out?
Clearly, I mean, he was hosted by the Ecuadorians. They decided after examining his case that as far as they were concerned, he was a political prisoner. He was given citizenship, Ecuadorian or temporary citizenship, so that he could stay in the embassy and went in there. But I think, they fell out for a number of reasons. But, he outstayed his welcome there. And then, of course, the documents were unsealed by the United States. And, they said, actually, you can't stay here any longer. And we saw British police go into the embassy and arrest him, and he was taken to Belmarsh. And then the period there was very protracted as his legal team tried to fight extradition to the United States. But in that time, the charges in Sweden were dropped because the timeline had run out. Again, we should say he says that he was utterly innocent of those charges and that the relations that he had in Stockholm were consensual.
Alex, thank you. After the break, more on the legacy of WikiLeaks and what next for Julian Assange. Back soon. Welcome back. Now, as you've already heard, the data released by WikiLeaks shook the world and also immediately split the world into supporters of Assange and his detractors. The sexual assault allegations emerging from Sweden forced even his friends to examine their support for the man, particularly given that it was only at the point that his extradition there seemed inevitable that he sought asylum from Ecuador. And that breach of his bail conditions entering the Ecuadorian embassy, well, that was ultimately why he ended up in Belmarsh prison. Frontline founder Vaughan Smith is still with us. Vaughan, was your view of the man coloured at all by these sexual assault allegations?
Well, that was the period of time where I did most to defend him. And I can tell you it wasn't easy as a middle-aged, white male trying to defend somebody with these allegations. I simply didn't believe the allegations. I also observed that there weren't very many people prepared to defend him. And it seemed incredibly unjust.
I can imagine. particularly, I suspect, on the day that he chose to breach his bail conditions and head into the Ecuadorian embassy. I mean, even at that point, did you perhaps have just a flash of doubt?
No, and I didn't. But you have to remember, I felt that it was such a lopsided battle that I was likely to defend Julian out of loyalty. Because I saw something different in him that wasn't being seen by others.
What then of his time in the Ecuadorian embassy? 2,487 days spent. Well, you can tell me. I suspect you know rather more about the conditions in which he was than I do.
Yes, I visited him quite frequently in the Ecuadorian embassy. There was a period of time where I knew that he was depressed, bored and isolated. I went to see him and he said, look, gosh, it'd be lovely to meet other people. All I meet is lawyers and journalists. So I used to bring him lunch on occasion, several occasions, and bring just friends.
The time in the embassy, it was an eclectic guest list, certainly, that were signing in to see him. Pamela Anderson, Lady Gaga, as you mentioned, all the human rights lawyers from left, right and centre. But presumably, though, those many, many years spent indoors, in a small room, not being able to leave, not being able to live a free life, so to speak, by his own decision, of course. But that must have had an effect, both physically and mentally, on him.
Oh, yes, it certainly did. You saw him very clearly physically deteriorate. I'd certainly, when I visited him in Belmarsh prison, but also mentally, he's somebody who needs quite a lot of mental stimulation. He's a very active mentally, and he wasn't getting that as much as I felt he needed, and he wasn't getting to go outside, and so it was depressing to see, and it all seemed incredibly unjust to me.
Were there times where he doubted that he would ever be free again? I wonder whether that perhaps might have happened when he was in Belmarsh, surrounded by those that you've just mentioned.
Well, I'm not sure how he felt, because it wasn't easy to visit him in Belmarsh, and I didn't do it because I didn't want to take places that were available to other people. His wife Stella and his father had built this extraordinary campaign.
In admitting guilt to that single charge, hasn't Julian Assange, in a certain way, undercut his entire case? That what he was doing was protected by the First Amendment, that what he was doing, that what WikiLeaks was doing more generally, was the job of journalists like me?
Well, yes, look, I think you're right to observe that this is not a complete victory for the freedom of the press. And it does have implications, as this whole matter has, for those journalists that report on national security matters. So it is important. But how much can one man take, or one family take? I think he's done enough. He's done more than enough to make his point. I think he's been incredibly courageous, and it shouldn't consume his life. This, the Americans have got what they want, which is ultimately vengeance, to make life completely miserable for somebody who messed with them. That's what it's. This is what it's. He was a political prisoner. I think he's also revealed weaknesses in our legal system, which I think are disappointing too. But no, look, enough's enough. I think we should have humanity, and I think Julian made his point pretty clearly.
What next then for Julian Assange? And do you have any plans to meet up with him anytime soon?
Well, I'm a bit sad because I haven't seen him for years, and if he's going to Australia, I'm not sure when I'll be able to see him, and I doubt he'll be travelling very much.
Sure.
So I'm sad, and I'm looking forward to the opportunity to see him. But look, there are a lot of people in the queue before me to speak to Julian. It is extraordinary the support that was generated by the campaign, quite extraordinary, and so. I really take my hat off to them. But ultimately, one has to observe it took the Australian government's intervention. Julian's Australian, remember, being chased by the Americans for compromising Americans. The rules are all. Had Julian been reporting on Russia, none of this would have happened. You can be sure. Yeah. Had Julian been reporting on China, but the fact is he got leaks from America, and the Americans didn't like it, and we were in their pocket.
Do you think this is work that he will feel a need to continue now free?
I think it'll depend on Julian's health, which I'm not clear about, but I hope to be updated on soon. If anybody deserves some time off, Julian does.
Vaughan Smith, many thanks. A final word from you, Alex, and I suppose one thing we can say, no matter whether you're a supporter of Assange or one of those who'd be happy to see him behind bars, is that it is undeniable that Wikileaks, that Julian Assange, really did change the way we view the world.
Julian Assange is a very divisive issue culturally as well as politically. I mean, it's one of those issues that falls more generally into the culture wars, and where what you see Julian Assange as is probably has something to do with where you fall on the political spectrum. But I think certainly from the authorities' point of view, alarm bells, even raw, blind, wake up in the middle of the night panic about this disruptive technology and disruptors like Julian Assange who were prepared to use it and wring everything you possibly could out of that technology in terms of getting information out to the public. And I suppose, to a certain extent, circumventing media, money, all of the channels that traditionally we have seen have a certain control on the pipeline of information.
Thanks, Alex. Clearly, Julian Assange remains a Marmite figure, or perhaps that should be Vegemite, in that the man and his actions still bitterly divide. It is undeniable that the information released by WikiLeaks was of huge importance. Crimes were revealed that shocked the world. Yet it is also undeniable that, whether intentionally or inadvertently, some of the information handed to WikiLeaks that made its way into the public domain did put lives at risk. Given the conditions he's endured as the US pursued what's ultimately amounted to just a single criminal conviction, a question arises. Has Julian Assange made future government whistleblowers more or less likely to come forward? That's your lot for this edition of The Daily. We're back again tomorrow.